Thank you very much indeed, Prime Minister. Thank you for coming. Thank you for helping make housing and social housing a key part of the national conversation. It really does deserve to be. And lots in that speech for us to consider here today, not least in the next session, which is entitled Housing, Politics and the Economy. As promised, we have a brilliant panel to offer summit-level expertise. If I could ask Polly, Sarah, Christine and Neil to join me on the stage. If I can steal the middle chair, you can sort of apply yourselves to various other forms of seating there. That would be absolutely lovely. Before we introduce the panel in full, I want to introduce you to another key element of our discussions today, which is Slido. Now, Slido, if you haven't used it before, there you can see on the screen, you log on, so get your phones out, you go onto the internet, you find slido.com, and it will ask you for a code. It's all very straightforward, and you just put in NHF 18, and at that point you can type in any question that you like. And the way that it works, to add to the fun, you can vote for other people's questions. If you think, that's brilliant, why didn't I think of that? You can push the button and it will move that question sort of higher up the pecking order to the point where I feel actually obliged to ask it, however stupid it might be. Slido has another secret as well. It can do instant polling. So I thought that perhaps in the wake of the Prime Minister's speech, we should actually do a poll right now on that. Why not? So if we can get the question up, what I was interested in finding out was does Theresa May's promise of £2 billion, so you heard the details just a moment ago, how does it make you feel? Are you greatly encouraged? Are you a little bit encouraged? Deeply disappointed? Just a little bit disappointed? Or is it just all a bit of a shrug? Heard it all before. Don't feel very strongly one way or the other. So, well, there's great encouragement at the moment, and there's some applause during the speech. So clearly, she's saying things that some people in the room like. In fact, greatly encouraged seems to be rising up the charts. We'll let that, as you all log on and find your way to Slido and participate, 3% big shrug. Let me go over here and I will introduce you to our brilliant panel. Yes, absolutely. So, Polly Neate is Chief Executive of Shelter, a campaigner for social justice in housing and well beyond. Sarah Jones MP is the Shadow Housing Minister. Also used to work for Shelter, where she lobbied for genuinely affordable housing. Neil O'Brien MP has never worked for Shelter, but has worked as a special advisor to Theresa May. He's also worked for the think tank Policy Exchange, which has been very active in the housing area for a long time, and has founded a new housing think tank, Onward. So go and have a look at that. And to my far right, we have Christine Whitehead, who is Professor in Housing Economics at the LSE, and will bring us some top-level expertise from academia to our discussion this morning. So how are we doing on our poll? Let's check. I presume we're still thrilled to bits. 63% are greatly encouraged. Actually, a lot of encouragement in the room for this speech. Sarah Jones, what did you make of the Prime Minister's speech?
Well, I should just say it's a pleasure to be here on this side of the stage, because I was on the board of a housing association for 5 years, so have been in the audience at this conference, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here, and a pleasure to be here with Shelter as well, having worked there. I think that we've seen some interesting changes in the way that the Conservatives, talk about housing, and that's good. So the Prime Minister was here today with her Chief of Staff, Gavin Barwell, who I happened to beat in 2017. Now, when I stood against him in 2015, his leaflet said, the Labour Party want you to build more council housing, that will mean less home ownership, that's a bad thing. And he's come on a journey, and she's come on a journey, and that's good, and I think we welcome that. But I think the idea that £2 billion after 2022 is in any way going to fix what we have as a huge housing crisis.
It's not just the money, it's also a commitment for the longer term, which is important, and it got a round of applause when she said
Well, I mean, as I heard at the weekend in Croydon, where I represent right now, 1,600 children are sleeping in emergency accommodation, not even temporary accommodation, but emergency accommodation. And the idea that raising levels of funding that warm words, welcome though they are going to make an impact when, even with the increased funding, we're still absolutely nowhere near the level of funding that we had in the last year of the Labour government, where we had £4 billion spent on grant funding alone, most of which went to housing associations. And, the doubling of homelessness, the reduction of home ownership, the huge increases we've seen in private rented sector and the insecurity of that sector and how untenable it is in the future, all of those things require big changes. And I think the Prime Minister is, she doesn't have a majority. It's very difficult for her with Brexit, and I understand that, to do anything big on the domestic agenda, but it's such a shame that she hasn't been a bit bolder, I would say.
Polly, there was a lot on social housing in that speech. We heard it at the conference,
Yeah.
Tory Party conference last year, after Grenfell. Still very much on the Prime Minister's mind, particularly around stigma, about changing societal attitudes to social housing. That, I presume, will be encouraging for you.
Yeah, I think I'm with the people here, actually, on the very encouraged end of the spectrum. I think that was a real landmark speech. I hope that we will reflect on it in the future and see it as having been a landmark speech. So what it was doing was pre-announcing elements of the spending review. What I hope is when we actually get to the spending review, we will see, yes, more than that, because that is what we need. But I think the vision the Prime Minister set out was very, very encouraging. And we've been working quite closely in our Commission on Social Housing with the Grenfell survivors and people from that local community. And the issue of tenants' voices not being heard, of stigma, and all of that, she's right. That really is an issue of significant concern to people living in social housing.
On social housing, obviously we've got a green paper now. It's a very green paper,
Yes,
and
it
not
is.
very much on supply. And I think,
that's right.
The point already made is that the Labour Party's commitment in supply to social housing, obviously very different to where the Conservatives are, despite the warm words.
Well, I think it's more difficult for the Conservatives to get themselves into a place of spending loads and loads of money, which is what we need on social housing. I really sincerely hope they will do that. And remember that, in fact, the biggest period of social house building was under a Conservative Prime Minister, Macmillan. True. We've seen neglect under successive governments of all parties. And, yes, we absolutely do need a very, very dramatic change on social housing. I hope, as I said, that we'll look back on this speech and see it as when the direction changed towards social housing, and that, everybody who stood up just now will feel fully vindicated in having done so.
Neil O'Brien, what did you make of what the Prime Minister had to say?
Well, I was also very encouraged. So I think one of the most exciting things that's happened in recent years is, for want of a better, less wonky word, a kind of de-residualisation of social housing. So firstly, we've seen, a new approach to building, so you can't tell the difference between social housing and other new build housing. I think that's really important. And secondly, you've seen this huge rise in the employment rate among people who are social tenants, highest it's been since 1983. 600,000 more families in social housing in work. So we're seeing a kind of reversal of some of the problems that we saw build up in the 60s, 70s and 80s. And I thought that the Prime Minister's commitment, it's useful to have that extra money for the long-term certainty, and it builds on other kinds of funding, and obviously that's not the only money that's going to be available in the 2020s, but it is useful to have the long-term certainty. What I was encouraged by was her general approach to and the whole tenor of our message about where we stand on social housing and social tenants, and I think that is the most encouraging thing in her.
It's worth pointing out that the latest figures on social housing, the fewest number of completions, really since the Second World War, fewer than 6,000 social houses added to the stock. This has not been a priority for the Conservative government for a long time. Can we really believe what the Prime Minister said
So
today?
the total amount of affordable housing, as you know, is...
No, I'm talking about social housing.
So 6,000 affordable, about 50,000 affordable units in total.
Including Help to Buy.
There's always a choice between having a bigger discount for a smaller number of people and a smaller discount for a larger number of people. And that's what the affordable housing model has been about. But that is a big increase. And let's just put this in a bit of context. Under the last Labour government, I don't mean to make a partisan point, the total stock of affordable housing went down by 420,000 homes. Since we came in 2010, it's gone up by 80,000 homes because we are building more. So we have both more affordable housing, we have more people in social housing in work, but there is an awfully long way to go, and I think that some of the things the government are consulting on at the moment, like capturing more land value uplift, like the Prime Minister's very encouraging words on getting housing associations to be lead developers, are encouraging, but those are things that we now need to land. If, in my constituency, somebody in this room wanted to come along and be the lead developer on a new housing project, I would be delighted. If you compare that to having Gladman's put in a planning application, I can tell you, you will be a lot more welcome when you put in applications in the Harborough constituency, because you have a social purpose, and you are, I think, part of the solution to the problem of our broken planning system, where we see land speculators and large developers capturing vast windfall profits from getting planning permission, and then refusing time and time again to try to provide the kind of amenities we want, whether it's affordable housing or landscaping or new community facilities. And I think people in my constituency are totally sick of that, and the people in this room are part of the solution to it.
Okay. Christine Whitehead, well, I'd like your impressions on what the Prime Minister had to say.
Well, it's terribly easy to be negative, especially when you're as old as I am, and you have been through so many cycles.
Yes.
I think I heard whole paragraphs exactly the same as Gordon Brown in 2009, when he moved forward money rather than put in additional money. And the important thing about this, I think, is although it's jam tomorrow, it is part of a steady-as-you-go approach to trying to improve the situation. But we're talking about improving the situation over a 10 or 20-year period. I don't think we're talking about massive changes that even in 5 years. And I think the other thing which I heard, which slightly concerned me, although we know it is Conservative policy, is that the example which he gave, the person was better off when they got on a shared ownership and therefore we had a step on the ladder. So we were still seeing social housing as a separate entity in a way...
Not quite as good as home ownership.
Not quite as good as home ownership.
Can we ever get to a point there where somebody in social housing feels that that is the tenure they prefer to owning their own home?
We can certainly get to a point, and we have been at the point, where people preferred social housing to private rented housing, and that changed over the last 20 years in a way which was really very scary, because when you get to a point where something which is being delivered at significantly sub-market rents, and people really would rather be in the, I was going to say god awful, but I shouldn't, private rented sector, you've got problems. I think that we do need to rethink, in some extent, the nature of home ownership and what people are trying to do. But it is the case that nearly everybody over 30 who's in a stable job, a stable relationships, would like to be homeowners, and that's true in Germany as well as in England.
Neil O'Brien, most people who own their own homes vote Tory, most people who rent vote Labour. That's been the sort of ideological divide in housing forever. Are we seeing a shift? One second, I'll come to you. But are we seeing, actually more agreement across the tribes?
I think we are. And to Christine's point, so politicians will always want to try and help people achieve what they want to achieve, and at the moment 9 out of 10 people want to own their own home, and so politicians will tend to favour home ownership. But when you know, when both sets of my grandparents were in social housing, and they wanted to get into social housing because it was better quality than the private rented sector in Glasgow in the 50s. And I think it's important that we have that emphasis on quality. And so one thing I really want to come out of the social housing green paper, and there's positive hints in there, is a big crusade to drive up standards. So in my constituency, people sometimes come to me and they say, well, you know, I've been transferred from one housing association to another, and the new one's not as good, and repairs aren't as quick, and they're cheaper, and so on and so forth. And I don't at the moment have any data I can look at as an MP to see how different associations are performing. Because I know we're constantly, as politicians, asking the impossible. We want you to build loads, and we want you to be amazing, you know, social drivers of change and to help everyone in every possible way. But I do think that while it was right to get rid of a lot of kind of bureaucracy, and we don't want to get into trying to micromanage housing associations, my colleague Eddie Hughes, who's a new MP, who's ex-housing association, is very strong on this. We do need to have some good national measures of performance and tenant satisfaction, because otherwise, you know, we can't see problems that are building up. And I think it would be really useful to have those kind of simple metrics that are not too bureaucratic, so that we can drive up performance and quality of life for tenants.
All right, so, Sarah. That ideological party divide on housing, maybe we are seeing changes. A speech from a Conservative Prime Minister that puts social housing, you know, right in the centre, and the Labour Party has clearly been, is part of also that discussion about thinking about housing across all tenures. So it's not just about the traditional Labour support, who will be largely in the social and rented sector.
Yeah, I think there's really interesting things going on, just to return to the public opinion on housing as well, because it is shifting, and you're seeing in the private rented sector an increase in the number of people who are voting, because people in the private rented sector are now in a position where they are in poorer quality housing in many cases than in social housing, and there's been a flip in that sense. And so you've got more people in the private rented sector voting. Seeing over the summer the politics of that play out, so seeing Jacob Rees-Mogg, Boris Johnson, these people who are kind of vying for the leadership, saying that housing is now the biggest issue, I think reflects where the voters are and what they're hearing on the doorstep. What I hear is people mostly who come to see me about housing are in private rented housing and desperate to get out, and they want to get into a housing association, or they want to get into council housing because that will give them the security in the long run.
Because so that's partly because the PRS can be so rubbish in places.
No, absolutely, and we need to do a huge amount to reform that. But I think both parties, I think Labour has historically been, you know, there's been this divide in terms of council homes. I think that the fact that the Conservatives are talking about that and talking about council housing, social housing being something that people should want to aspire to is great. But the point you made about the lowest number of social homes built last year since records began, you know, we need the reality to catch up with the rhetoric, but it's a step in the right direction.
Polly?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to question the idea that people are choosing the private rented sector over social housing or seeing it as better in some way. I think actually they're in the private rented sector a lot of the time because there simply is not enough social housing.
Tenure of last resort.
For people who need it. Yeah, absolutely. And we're seeing families day in and day out in our frontline services all over the country who are desperate to get into social housing, desperate to get out of the short-term insecurity of the private rented sector. I think it's true that we do need to make social housing more aspirational. I think people do want it already, but I think we do need a really powerful vision for social housing that can take us back to an era where, you know, like in the Macmillan era, where people wanted to see in their communities large amounts of social housing being built. That will take time, and the issue with the private rented sector, which is now the single biggest cause of homelessness, is eviction from a private tenancy. We need to make some urgent improvements in the private rented sector right now because people are losing out so desperately badly. And then in the long term, the solution to that is a really bold vision of social housing. And it has to coincide, it has to coexist, rather, with people's ambition to own their own home. There's nothing wrong with people wanting to own their own home.
I'm going to come on to owner. I just want to finish on this point on social housing, because when it was originally created, it was supposed to be homes for teachers and nurses and doctors and lawyers, you know, as well as everybody else.
Yeah.
But it was Harold Wilson, I believe, who was sort of introduced the first residualisation of the tenure. But can we really go back to a pre-Wilson age where people get, you know, significantly sub-market rented accommodation if they're not deemed to be in real need? Isn't it always going to be a residualised tenure?
I think the number of people who cannot afford to participate in any meaningful way on the open market in housing is a very large and quite varied group of people, and social housing needs to be available for all of those people.
So a doctor living in social housing?
Well, I would question whether a doctor can't participate in the housing market. But I think at the moment, we have a situation where, partly due to the price of land as well, which I'm sure is something we'll get on to. Yeah, so the market in housing, and I do question whether the kind of affordable end of still the house buying end is really achieving what it is setting out to do. But the market in housing is not accessible to a huge amount of people. And those people do need social housing. We need to face up to this because it's a really massive, very, very ambitious new vision that is needed.
All right, I want to go to Slido, because I just like saying the word Slido apart from anything else. The top question, 51 uptick, so that's obviously is chiming with a lot of people in the room. We still have an obsession with home ownership, and the housing market has been distorted by Help to Buy. What is the latest thinking for unwinding Help to Buy? Neil O'Brien, Onward has been very much in favour of trying to encourage ways of getting people to own their own homes. Is home ownership distorting the market? Do we need to think again?
So I think we need to put this in a bit of context. Actually, although we think of ourselves as a nation of homeowners, actually Britain has one of the lowest home ownership rates in Europe.
And going down.
And going down. And so most people in one year, but it has been since 2003 generally going down. Yeah, sure. And so the number of people who want to own is a lot higher than the number of people who own at the moment. I wouldn't say that we have an obsession with it, but it is what people want. And I think sometimes we project onto Germany this kind of thing of it being a land of milk and honey. It's true that a smaller proportion of people who rent in Germany have problematically high rents, but because there are so many more renters in Germany, actually there are more people paying dangerously high shares of their income on rent and housing in Germany than there are here. So it's not all paradise to have a kind of heavily
what about Help to Buy now? And Help to Buy has completely distorted the home ownership market. It's driving a lot of the building that's going on at the moment. It's a vast sum going to people who are pretty well off in order to get on the ladder at all.
So it is, it's certainly, as you say, driving building. In some parts of the country, it's supporting really large parts of supply, and you see for the first time there's a big gap between the transactions in the secondary market and the number of new builds that are going on, and that is Help to Buy. So we should be very careful about just turning Help to Buy off very suddenly.
Do you think it should be eventually?
But just on this point about the size of the private rented sector, my own view is that the private rented sector at the moment does not need to continue to expand. And in the recent paper that I wrote that you referred to, talked about some things we could do on the tax front to try and get houses to flow from the private rented sector into owner occupation. Because I think that for a long time we've had buy-to-let, kind of let rip really, and huge numbers of properties every year transferred from ownership into the let sector. I would also like to see us do more to encourage quality in the private letted sector as well, because, there's some everyone in this room will have seen Vent Your Rent on Twitter and some of the horrendous conditions that people are living in. I'm proud of some of the things we've done in terms of banning rip-off fees of various kinds, but I do think we need to do more to encourage quality in the private rented sector as well as in the public rented sector.
Excellent. I've left my iPad over there. Can you put the questions back up for me? Actually, I'll go and get the iPad. There we are.
Here we go.
Here we are. This is the professional way that we're doing this. So I wanted to talk about land. And I thought, what about public land? Is government doing enough to make it available for development? So there's that bit of it about public land. But the Prime Minister, and it was interesting, and Neil's just mentioned it too, thinking about land value capture. The NHF's own work suggests £13 billion of boost to the value of land simply by giving it planning permission in a single year. Christine, is this argument, I'm sure you'll have heard it for decades, but can we actually now get somewhere with this and think about how we're going to build these 300,000 homes a year that we need using that kind of money?
Well, I think the issue for the public sector, which is not quite the start of the question
we'll start with that and move on.
But the start from the public sector is that most of the people in the public sector desperately want the money they're going to make from their land. So even within the GLA context, TfL has got a massive hole in their budget. They want to get high prices for their land. If we then have a 50% affordable requirement, then TfL will get less money.
Yes.
And that tension, because of the extent to which local authorities are dependent upon the development process to get money, revenue, in a way which it never was before, that tension is enormously difficult. If you're a national health service, a chief executive of a hospital can get kicked out for selling off a bit of a nurse's home, in a way which, we think of as being a housing problem, but no, the health service has the same problem as well. So the public land, there is a tension, and it's a tension within this financing issue. Of course, we want public land to be used. We want it to be used for joint ventures, for long-term development and long-term management, so that we can keep it in reasonably affordable ways for generations, and the local authority or whoever it is gets a revenue stream in that context.
Well, actually, their investors quite like social housing, don't they? I mean, it's not a massive return necessarily, but it's a guaranteed return over the long term.
It's less guaranteed than it was, and this is showing in terms of the Standard & Poor's and other issues of this context, because we haven't any longer... The way that the whole thing was set up was there was an implicit guarantee from housing benefit.
Yes.
And that has been in place since 1988. Now that implicit guarantee is not there to the same extent. It's there, but it's nothing like so strong.
Very good point.
There is an issue about finance.
Sarah, maybe we should just pick on this point about welfare reform and how that is changing the housing market. So Julia Rugg, when she announced her review into the PRS last week, was talking about an endemic problem with rent arrears, slum tenure, the possibility of a shadow housing market booming because of cuts to housing benefit, people unable to pay their rent, and the rollout of universal credit. Yep. Are we perhaps looking in the wrong place? Actually, we need to be looking to the DWP rather than the Ministry of Housing.
Well, it's funny, isn't it? The amount of money that just gets poured into a black hole on housing across the board. So 100 billion pounds over the next 5 years will be spent on housing benefit. 100 billion. I mean, it's an extraordinary amount of money that just gets poured away. And the caps and the welfare budget has had a big impact. I mean, if you read the Smith Institute did some interesting work looking at the amount of increases in rent arrears we've had in council homes and housing association, and just the general cuts to welfare are having this big impact. So on the one hand, we're pouring money into housing benefit. On the other, people are poor. More people are working, but they're working poor. They're poorer than they were before. We've got 4.5 million people in poverty. So you have this system where we're paying all this money, and a lot of the government funding as well for housing is poured into a black hole. It's help to buy, it's stamp duty, I'm not denying it's good for the people who are benefiting, but it doesn't help the state. And then when it comes to land, you have this ridiculous system where, because you have to buy land at hope values, you're paying hundreds of times more than its value.
Would Labour change that?
So again, we're pouring money. So the amount of money we're spending is huge. We're just spending it in completely the wrong way.
What would Labour do?
So Labour think that we should absolutely enable councils to buy through CPO in exactly the same way, actually, as Neil has suggested.
At original value?
At original value, not hope value. We want to set
Will
up...
landowners still come forward, or are you saying CPO?
Well, CPO, but what we want is a plan...
massive amounts of compulsory land.
Yeah, so what we're hoping is that would create a system where landowners would sell for less value. So we should have a plan. We're supposed to have a plan-led housing system, but only 50% of local authorities have a plan.
Sure.
And you need to put some kind of structure around what's happening in order to make sure we're building the homes that we need. So absolutely, you need to look at how do we release this land before its hope value, and we want to create a sovereign land trust to try and enable that to happen. In Germany, they have development zones where you have a kind of zone where the land can be bought at a lower value, and that kind of thing is good. We also need to look at land value tax, want to look at that as an option. So we would have a look at council tax and business rates when we got into government and look at whether we're taxing land in the right way. I think there's a wealth of things you could do that are much more radical that actually would mean we spent some money that would be good for the state.
It's going to need to be cross-party, isn't it? Because otherwise landowners will just wait till the government that looks more to their liking comes along. Can Labour and Conservatives work together on land value capture? Is this like
well,
you and Neil?
I think
can have a
what I've
conversation?
read from Neil is very sensible and not dissimilar to what we're saying. I think there is some consensus there, and I think there is on the private rented sector. I think there is on quite a lot of issues. When I'm in the chamber, there are backbench Conservatives who are agreeing. We just need to see if we can work a bit more closely together and persuade the powers that be.
Polly?
I think there is a growing consensus, definitely, and particularly on CPO reform, where we've been working quite closely with Onward.
So you've got your man in number 10 now, haven't you?
That's right. So there really is a big head, I think, a significant head of steam behind that and a real opportunity. But I did just want to pick up the issue of welfare reform, because I don't think it's okay to kind of gloss over that. The housing benefit issue is a really difficult issue because the reason the government have capped it is because it's constantly being poured into the coffers of private landlords. And in a sense, you can totally understand why it's been capped. The problem is that the fact that it's been capped is leaving people in, and I'm not using this word in an exaggerating way, it is leaving people in destitution. We are seeing families who are suffering really desperately because of A, the freeze on housing benefit and local housing allowance, and B, universal credit. And we're seeing landlords increasingly unwilling to rent, private landlords I'm talking about, rent to people who are on housing benefit. We're campaigning on this jointly with National Federation of Housing Associations, actually. Okay. So I think it is really, really important to acknowledge the role that welfare reform plays, because I keep banging on about the need for more social housing. But until that happens, the other side of the coin of reforming the private rented sector is we have to do something about welfare reform. Okay. Otherwise, people will be seeing an absolutely unacceptable level of destitution before we can ever get around to building the social housing that we need.
Interesting point. I want to go back to Slido again and some more of the questions from that. We do have roving microphones, so if there's a question that you'd like to ask in person, you can throw your hand up and I could be persuaded. Gemma de Brito has asked a question. Gemma, are you able to ask? Yes, Gemma, let's get a roving microphone to you. You can ask your question in person. Yes, you've found, there we are, there's Gemma. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Gemma de Brito from Nottingham Community Housing Association. I think sometimes when we hear about capital funding, affordable rents and social rents kind of get mixed together, but it makes a big difference to us. In some areas, affordable rents are way, way higher than social rents. In my area, the East Midlands, they're about the same, but the affordable rent product is a problem for us because the service charges are linked in with the rent. It means we make a big loss on care and support properties, and it means we make a loss on flats as well, but we have this big problem because Homes England say it's affordable rent or nothing. Yeah. So this new capital funding, are we going to see social rent in there?
Yeah. Neil, I mean, this is the argument about what affordable really means and how affordable it is to whom is a real one. And as Gemma was saying, at the sharp end, actually, there are products there that don't look affordable at all, which are still badged as affordable.
So on the specific point, I'd love to have a further conversation about your point about the service charge and the link across to the rent, because I don't understand that and I would love to understand it. On the more general point about affordable and social, i.e. bigger discounts or smaller discounts compared to the market, we've been through this very, very difficult period fiscally where we've been getting rid of the biggest deficit in our whole peacetime history, and that's meant incredibly difficult decisions on everything from welfare to housing to lots of other things. You appreciate as well as I do that my MP colleagues will be queuing up at the moment with all kinds of different pressures they want to spend more on. They'd love to spend more on social care and local government. They'd love to spend more on the NHS and schools and the police and indeed housing. So there's always going to be a choice about, do you want to house some people at a deeper discount or more people at a shallower discount? And that has big implications for the spend around the country. So one of my long-term obsessions has been about the balance of capital spending around this country. So on the science front, we spend half of our budget in London, Cambridge, and Oxford. When it comes to transport, about half the budget for capital in London.
Where's your seat, Neil?
And for housing, it's in the East Midlands, the East Midlands, snap. And for housing, around half the budget's been going in London. And the more that you make it about deeper discounts, the more that is steering it towards London. And now, I would not at all downplay the difficulties, and Polly's alluded to some of these things, about expensive rents in and around London. But there are consequences to all these choices that are inescapable, and if you want to go for more, I understand from the briefing yesterday that some of this 2 billion certainly is for social as well as affordable renting, so there will be a mix. But there is an inescapable choice there about bigger discounts for some versus smaller discounts for more. And if I'm completely honest with you, if I was going to make a pitch, which I did in my recent document, for us to spend a lot more on housing, a group of people who I think a lot of my Conservative colleagues are very sympathetic to, and I am incredibly sympathetic to when they come to my surgery, are people who would have got social housing 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, but can't access it today just because there's too many people want it. And they're people, they don't need a massive discount, they are working, but the private rented sector will never allow them to save up anything because it's just too expensive for them. And I think there's a sort of missing tenure from my point of view of people who are working on low incomes and they can't get kind of secure, not incredibly cheap, but quite cheap rented housing. And I think that's a conversation I'd love to have with anyone else in the room who's interested in that.
Yeah. Christine.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground, and some of it is not necessarily quite as straightforward as we're making it sound. I think in the context of land value capture, one of the things which we really do need to think about very hard is who's going to get the benefit. Is it going to go to central government, in which case it will disappear off to the Treasury and will never be seen again from a point of view of housing? Or is it going to stay as it is at the moment, to the extent that we have a direct capture at the local authority level?
What was Section 106?
Section 106 and SIL.
Yeah.
And I think that you say that we want cross-party agreement. We certainly want cross-party agreement. And historically in housing, we have had cross-party agreement apart from land value taxation. That has gone up and down like yo-yos. And I'm therefore a little worried that we might do better to try to do it in the context which we're currently in, which would be to improve the Section 106 SIL system, to increase the strategic...
Which does appear to be where the government is at the moment.
Increase the strategic SIL, which helps to pay for broader-based infrastructure, etc. But this does have the issue of the monies will mainly be in the south, rather than in the Midlands and the north.
Okay, I want to go back to questions. Number one on the list, in joint first place, Ian Munro has a question on right to buy. Ian, are you prepared? Yes, why don't we get Ian to ask the question in person? Microphone is roving rapidly towards you. Look at that. Marvellous.
Thank you. My question is about right to buy. I don't think Teresa mentioned right to buy to any great extent there. I know that one of the issues on estates is the condition of houses that are being sold to people, the conditions they end up in, and the fact that they actually end up getting rented out. We can't do anything about antisocial behaviour. We're not replacing those houses. The receipts that came into local authorities and housing associations have never been used to replace the ones that have been lost. It's just a busted flush as a policy. It's just something that needs to stop.
Okay. Politicians
in Scotland and in Wales have had the cojones to do it. Is a government in England going to do that?
We shall ask the question. Well, what would Labour do, Sarah?
Can I just go back and answer very quickly the question about the definition of affordable housing? Because I do think it's just important to say that what the Labour Party has said is we want to build 100,000 affordable homes a year over 10 years. But we've said we'll change the definition of affordable and we'll link it to earnings as well as house prices. Okay. So it makes it a much fairer system. And when I was started on the board of a housing association in kind of 2012, we went through that journey of going, you know, up and up and up as the percentages of affordable. And on the board, it's really painful. I'm looking at my colleagues who are on the board with me. It's a painful process as a housing association board member when you're having to provide homes at 80% in London when clearly they're not affordable, and it was a very difficult thing to go through. On right to buy, our policy is that we would suspend right to buy. We're very clear about that. It's a difficult one because obviously we want people to aspire to own their own home, and we want to enable them to do that. But I think the hemorrhaging we've seen through right to buy of stock, we're still seeing about 18,000 homes a year through right to buy lost that aren't replaced. And it's something that I think those of us, again, who were in this room or in this conference a few years ago when the government had announced they were going to introduce right to buy in housing associations, and we all as board members had to go through a vote where we decided whether we were going to support the voluntary agreement or legislative change. I mean, that was enormously painful and very unhelpful, I think, for housing generally. So I think the time has come, but we need to absolutely respect that people want to own their own home, and we need to enable that to happen where we can. But right to buy's time has come, I think.
Neil O'Brien, in the context of what the Prime Minister was saying about social housing and the importance of it, and only last week the Ministry accepting that they had yet again missed their targets on one-for-one replacement by a significant margin, the CIH has asked for the suspension of right to buy until we can sort it out. It's a reasonable thing to ask, isn't it?
So just to recap the case for the policy, I mean, I meet all the time people who use the right to buy.
Well, we know people want to buy,
and
but in the context of not being able to offer...
Just to make the case, it's been completely life-transforming for them, and it's given them a sense of ownership and let them change their property and do all kinds of things which those of us who are lucky enough to own our own homes take for granted. So it has wonderful benefits. You will notice that the government did not legislate to try and have the right to buy extended to the housing association sector. Instead, we have the voluntary deal. And that commitment that wasn't there in previous generations to one-for-one replacement is the reason for the numbers that I gave at the start, which is you had this 400,000 plus fall in the stock of affordable housing during the last Labour government, and you have an increase since 2010. So it is an important policy. It's in a mix, so there will be a choice, I think, in the spending review for whether you want to do that or do you want to do something else. Do you want to, for example, promote a new tenure of cheap rented housing? And these are all, I talked about a bit about some of the choices in the spending review just a minute ago, and the choice about do you want to further extend the right to buy pilot that's running at the moment versus other things will be a big one, which I think only the Treasury can make when you see all the different choices that you've got within the housing world. I think right to buy has been a great thing for a lot of people, but there are also lots of other wonderful things we want to do in housing as well, so it's a choice.
Polly, what would Shelter want to see happen to right to buy?
I don't have any problem with right to buy as long as you are building homes for everyone.
So the replacement promise has to be absolutely solid.
You can't have right to buy and simultaneously run down other forms of housing and have people languishing in totally... Thank you. So it's not right to buy in itself, and of course people want to own their own home. I want to own my own home, fair enough. But you absolutely can't have people who just fall out of the bottom of the market and have nowhere decent to call home. I think, I'll leave it there. I was going to say something else.
Well, was it going to be controversial? If it was, we want to hear it. All right, okay.
You're not going to say it.
If I think of a better way to phrase it, I might...
All right, well, when you have, let me know. Christine, we've got another question on social housing from Sasha Deepwell. So is Sasha here? Where are they? Oh, they're all in a little sort of nest, right? They're sort of encouraging each other.
They've probably been beating each other up.
Geeing each other along. Yes, microphone coming. So this is another question on social. We're coming towards the end, so it's probably going to be our last question, certainly from the floor.
Hi, Sasha Deepwell from Irwell Valley Homes in Greater Manchester. What I was really questioning was the kind of limited access that seems to be being proposed in relation to social housing grant, which is what helps us achieve social housing. It's linked to a few other questions. People are asking about small housing associations, about community-led and so on. And I guess what I'd like to see is the panel's view on, can we open up social housing grants so we can actually produce social housing throughout the country. It's needed in every area and appreciated in every area.
And I think that's, Christine, I think this is, we sort of touched on this, that we think of housing, the housing crisis, but of course it's a series of different housing crises in different places, which require different solutions. And while I don't want to cut across your question entirely, the sense in which those answers come from devolved assemblies rather than necessarily being dreamed up in Whitehall might be an interesting development.
Yes, it might. I think the issue around where grants should be is a very difficult one, and it's come up a number of times. And the most obvious thing is that there are still parts of the country where social rents are within 5% of market rents, and sometimes they're above rather than below.
Exactly.
And so there is an issue that housing associations in particular should be using in that context the capital assets they built up since 1988 to expand their development rather than necessarily depend upon grant, particularly if the grant does nothing else but raise the land value, which it often does. And so that, in that sort of context. But the question of whether devolved authorities should have much more devolved power in the context of housing, it seems to me to be perfectly obvious that it should, because the significant point about the devolved authorities is that they're trying to put infrastructure together with housing.
Let's see if we can find some political unanimity on this. Neil, more real control over housing policy and strategy at, say, combined authority level than stuck in Whitehall.
Absolutely. So one of the most exciting things I worked on when I was in government was the start of the devolution agreements. And in the very first one with Greater Manchester, there was a 400 million loans fund to help regenerate land into housing there. In the Cambridge deal, I remember there was some capital funding as well, because appallingly expensive housing there. And so I think that's an exciting start. I'd love to see further devolution of housing powers, not just to the areas that have got mayors at the moment, but to other areas that have got some kind of strategic joint plan. For example, one thing I think is really helpful in London is having the PTAL, the passenger transport, because the mayor has control over the buses, you can guarantee public transport access, and that means you can build a greater density. And I'd love to see other parts of the country, including the East Midlands, able to do some of those things. Okay. You know, the combination of that and changing the role of the social housing associations, I think, to Christine's point, it's not just about getting more affordable housing, it's about more housing overall. And I think with empowered housing associations working together with empowered local government, that could really be quite powerful in terms of adding to supply and bringing forward land that would never otherwise come forward.
Absolutely. Sarah, are Labour on the same page, do you think, in terms of devolving strategic power on housing and maybe beyond?
Yes, absolutely. And
no.
Go on.
Don't know, have you...
They've decided...
Oh, there we are, we are back again.
Yes, absolutely. And my boss, John Healy's speaking tomorrow, and I think, listen to what he's going to be saying about where Labour would put some of the grant and how we'd support some of the smaller housing associations. if this is our last question, I want to make one point, which is that we talked a bit about Germany, and I was in Berlin last Friday, and our sister party were talking about the coalition that they have negotiated with Angela Merkel, because Angela Merkel has had to go into coalition with them. And at the coalition table during those debates were the tenants' unions in Germany. They had a voice at that table. And the idea that when we had coalition, when the Lib Dems and the Conservatives were talking, that any voice from any tenant, from any sector would be there, was extraordinary. So we have a long way to go, but I think it's quite exciting, the idea of what we could do if we could bring the voices of our tenants together, and we could have a much more powerful voice when it comes to housing policy in this country.
Great. Polly, did you think how you were going to phrase the thing you wanted to mention?
No.
But what would you like to say on this?
What I think about this is that social housing is quite unique in terms of something, a benefit, if you like, that the state provides for people. Because, you get your home, you can afford it in the long term, and then, if you then get a job, that doesn't disappear or diminish in value. It's a springboard that people really can use to build their lives on. And I think we need to stop this thing of social housing being on one side and aspiration being on the other side. I think that's completely false. And actually, not only can it be an aspiration, I think it also needs to be as sacrosanct in the way we think about ourselves as a country, as something like the NHS or education.
As proud of it as that.
Or, yeah, if one of us walks out of here, God forbid, gets knocked down by a bus, we know it's our right that somebody will pick us up, take us to a world-class, actually, hospital, and patch us up, and it doesn't matter if we could afford it or not. People are falling out of the bottom of the housing market, and there simply is no equivalent to that. The safety net isn't there, despite the fantastic efforts of everybody in this room. It is not there. You cannot pursue the other policies that we've all voted for as a country. You can't pursue all the rest of those policies, including welfare reform, and then not provide people with the right to a home. It
Excellent.
simply isn't sustainable.
Fantastic, fantastic stuff. A powerful peroration to finish. We have come to the end. It's time for carbs, caffeine, and comfort. 1 second. I want you to make your way out of this room in a moment. There is an exciting array of opportunity awaiting you beyond those doors. Future Expo is running throughout the summit. There should have been a flyer on your chair explaining all about that. Speaker's Corner, you can take part in a discussion around housing as a commodity. There's a workshop on the gender pay gap. You can visit the expert zone to find out about devolution. We've just been talking about that. Back here, 12 o'clock, please, 12 noon. But for now, thank you for all your questions. And to our brilliant panel, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed.